The dust falls away in silence. For 3 days, the excavation team had worked beneath a tarpaulin stretched against the wind, scraping centimeter by centimeter through sediment that geologists insisted should hold nothing but sterile clay. This layer, they had been told, predated agriculture, predated writing, predated the very idea of organized human effort. And yet here, pressed into stone the color of dried blood, was a surface no accident of nature could explain. A grid, precise, repeating, carved with an edge so clean it could not have come from flint or bone. The lead archaeologist crouches over it now, breath fogging in the cold morning air, gloved fingers tracing lines that should not exist. Somewhere beneath the dirt of a world we think we understand, something was waiting. Not a shard, not a fragment, a finished object, engineered with an intention that mainstream chronology has no room for. Carbon dating will return a number that the lab technicians will run twice, certain of an error. There is no error. The strata above it are undisturbed. The artifact did not fall into this layer. It was buried in it, deliberately, by hands that the textbooks insist had not yet learned to count, to build, to remember. Consider the implications sitting in that dirt. If the date holds, then everything taught in lecture halls about the dawn of civilization, the slow crawl from cave to village to city, collapses under the weight of a single object the size of a human palm. What if civilization did not begin where, or when, we were told? What if it ended somewhere first, and we are only now finding the wreckage? If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe and turn on the notifications as we dive in. Mainstream archaeology offers a tidy story, one repeated in textbooks, museum placards, and university lecture halls without serious challenge for over a century. Civilization, we are told, did not simply appear. It crawled into existence. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, scattered and isolated, slowly discovered agriculture around 12,000 years ago. From that discovery came surplus food, then settlement, then the first fragile villages along fertile riverbanks. Centuries passed before those villages hardened into towns. Centuries more before towns became cities with walls, temples, and kings. This timeline is not a guess. It is treated as bedrock, the scaffolding upon which every other historical claim is built. Carbon dating, stratigraphy, and the so-called archaeological record are presented as an unbroken linear chain of evidence. Simple tools before complex ones, crude pottery before refined ceramics, mud huts before monumental stone. The story is comforting in its order. Humanity advances upward, generation by generation, like a single organism slowly waking from a long sleep. Within this framework, there is no room for sophistication arriving early, no room for an object exhibiting calculated geometry, intentional design, or technical mastery appearing in a layer of earth that, by definition, should only contain the crude detritus of subsistence survival. The official narrative depends on a strict sequence. Disturb that sequence, and the entire structure built upon it begins to tremble. It is this rigid sequence that the artifact pulled from the dirt threatens to shatter completely. The first crack appears in the precision itself. Modern engineers, when shown high-resolution scans of the artifact's surface, describe tolerances that should be impossible without specialized cutting instruments. The grid lines are not merely straight, they are uniform, spaced with a consistency measured in fractions of a millimeter, the kind of repetition that speaks not of a craftsman's eye, but of a system, a method, a standardized unit of measurement applied with mathematical discipline. Mainstream chronology insists that standardized measurement, the very concept of a fixed unit applied consistently across an object, belongs to the era of organized states and centralized authority, thousands of years after this artifact was supposedly buried. There is no civilization on record, according to the accepted timeline, capable of producing this kind of consistency at this depth in the earth. Then there is the tool mark problem. Microscopic analysis of the carved grooves reveals clean, controlled striations, inconsistent with stone or bone implements. The edges are too sharp, the depth too uniform. Whatever cut these lines moved with a steadiness that suggests either extraordinary skill, refined over generations of practiced craft, or a tool category absent from every accepted inventory of the period. And finally, the silence. If a culture capable of this precision existed, where are its other artifacts? Where are the workshops, the failed attempts, the broken practice pieces that should litter any developing technical tradition? There are none. The object exists in isolation, a finished masterpiece with no visible apprenticeship behind it, as though it were not the beginning of a tradition, but the last surviving fragment of one already lost. If the official sequence cannot explain an object, this refined appearing this early, then perhaps the sequence itself is the error. A growing body of independent researchers, historians working outside the gate-kept halls of mainstream academia, propose a different model entirely, that human civilization did not climb steadily upward from primitive beginnings, but instead descended from an earlier, more advanced state, one nearly erased from memory by catastrophe. This is the theory of a lost global epoch, a forgotten age of technical sophistication that predates everything currently taught as the dawn of history. Some call it a pre-flood civilization. Others point to fragmented references across dozens of unrelated cultures, flood myths, ages of giants, golden eras of lost knowledge, as cultural memory of the same singular event, an event so catastrophic it severed continuity between what came before and what struggled to rebuild after. Under this framework, the artifact is not an anomaly. It is a remnant, a surviving fragment of technical knowledge from a civilization whose name, language, and full achievements have been swallowed by time, geological upheaval, or deliberate erasure. The survivors who rebuilt afterward did not invent precision measurement and structural engineering from nothing. They inherited fading echoes of it, passed down in increasingly degraded form, until later generations, no longer understanding the origin of the knowledge, mistook recovery for invention. This would explain why monumental structures across entirely disconnected ancient cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, share startlingly similar geometric principles. Not coincidence, not convergent invention. Inheritance from a common, far older source, one history has been trained to overlook entirely. Chapter 5. The suppressed evidence returned to the artifact itself, and the deeper anomalies emerge under closer examination. Spectral analysis of the stone reveals a mineral composition inconsistent with the local geology of the excavation site. The material did not originate where it was found. It was transported, deliberately, from a source location researchers have yet to definitively identify, suggesting trade networks, logistics, and resource management far beyond what isolated hunter-gatherer bands are believed capable of organizing. Then there is the matter of the symbols bordering the grid, faint, eroded marks that several independent linguists have noted bear a structural resemblance, not in appearance but in underlying logic, to proto-writing systems unearthed thousands of miles away and separated by millennia in the official timeline. A formal academic paper raising this comparison was submitted for peer review. It was rejected, not on the basis of flawed methodology, but reportedly for, in the words of one anonymous reviewer, implications too disruptive to current chronological consensus. This is not an isolated case. Across the world, similar artifacts surface with quiet regularity. An engraved stone in South America, with geometric precision matching no known regional tradition. A metal alloy fragment in Eastern Europe dated to a period before metallurgy was supposedly developed. A structural foundation beneath a known ancient city that predates the city itself by thousands of years. Individually, each is dismissed as an outlier, a contamination error, a misdating. Collectively, a pattern emerges that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Researchers who pursue these threads seriously often find themselves marginalized, their funding quietly withdrawn, their papers rejected without substantive critique, their reputations recast from archaeologist to fringe theorist within a single career-ending cycle. The evidence does not vanish. It simply stops being permitted into the official record. filed away in storage rooms and unpublished reports, waiting for a future willing to look again. Why would anyone suppress evidence this significant? The answer lies not in shadowy conspiracy for its own sake, but in something more mundane and more powerful: institutional inertia and the protection of intellectual legacy. Modern archaeology as a discipline was formalized in the 19th century, an era when Western academic institutions were constructing a tidy, linear narrative of human progress, one that conveniently placed contemporary industrial society at the triumphant peak of a long upward climb. Funding, prestige, and entire academic careers became built upon this framework. To question the foundational timeline is not merely to propose a new theory, it is to threaten the legitimacy of the institutions, university departments, museum boards, and publishing bodies that built their authority upon the old one. Major institutions, including long-established scientific bodies with vast archival holdings, have historically been documented quietly shelving or reclassifying finds that did not conform to accepted chronology. This is not always malicious intent. Often, it is simple bureaucratic self-preservation, the quiet discomfort of admitting that a century of accumulated consensus rests on an incomplete picture. Religious institutions, too, played a role in earlier eras, when timelines of human history were tied closely to theological frameworks that left little room for civilizations existing before the timeline. Early modern historians, working within these constraints, often dismissed or reframed anomalous findings to fit existing belief structures rather than challenge them. The result is not one grand, centralized cover-up orchestrated by a single shadowy hand. It is something more insidious, a distributed, self-reinforcing system in which every individual actor, researcher, curator, editor has incentive to maintain the comfortable levity. If this artifact is what the evidence suggests, the consequences extend far beyond a single excavation site or an adjusted date on a museum placard. They reach into the very architecture of how humanity understands itself. It would mean that the story of steady, linear progress, the comforting idea that each generation builds incrementally upon the last in an unbroken march toward enlightenment, is fundamentally incomplete. Instead, human history would resemble something closer to a series of rises and catastrophic falls, advanced knowledge achieved, lost, partially recovered, and lost again, across cycles far longer and more violent than currently acknowledged. It would mean that monumental structures long attributed to relatively recent ancient cultures, structures whose construction techniques remain debated even within mainstream academia, might instead represent inherited knowledge, fragments of engineering principles salvaged from a civilization whose name has not survived, repurposed by later peoples who possessed the will to build but not the full understanding of why the old methods worked. It would mean that the gap between perceived primitive humanity and the engineers capable of producing this artifact is not a gap of biological capability, but of historical record, a wound carved into the timeline by catastrophe, conquest, or deliberate erasure. Most unsettling of all, it would mean that the modern era's confidence in its own technological supremacy, the assumption that no civilization before ours possessed comparable sophistication, may be a form of historical amnesia rather than fact. We may not be standing at the summit of human achievement. We may simply be standing in the rubble of something far older, mistaking the broken pieces for the beginning rather than recognizing them as the end. The artifact now rests under glass, cataloged, photographed, assigned a number that reduces it to a line item in a database. Visitors will walk past it without pausing, unaware that the object in front of them quietly contradicts everything the placard beside it claims to know. Perhaps that is the final, haunting truth of discoveries like this one. They do not announce themselves with the fanfare history deserves. They sit in silence, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to ask the uncomfortable question. What other objects rest right now in storage rooms and archive basements, misfiled, misdated, deliberately overlooked because they do not fit the story we have agreed to tell ourselves? How many fragments of a forgotten age have already been found, only to be quietly buried a second time, not beneath earth, but beneath bureaucracy and convenience? The official timeline offers comfort. It tells us we know where we came from, that our rise was steady, earned, inevitable. But comfort is not the same as truth, and buried in the dirt, indifferent to the institutions built to explain it away, this artifact continues to ask the only question that matters. What if the beginning we were taught was never the beginning at all, but the echo of an ending we have not yet allowed ourselves to remember?